Raymond Foye is a writer, curator, editor, and publisher based in New York City. He has worked for City Light Books, New Directions, and Petersburg Press, and from 1986 to 1996, he was the editor and publisher with Francisco Clemente of Hanuman Books. Raymond is a consulting editor for the Brooklyn Rail. And over to you, Raymond.
Thank you very much, Sophia. Today, we're going to be speaking with painter Chris Martin, born 1954, known for his broad practice that includes the incorporation of unconventional materials, such as carpets, glitter, vinyl LP, spray paint, and oil paint. He was born in Washington, D.C. He grew up spending much time in the Catskills, which is where both Chris and I are coming to you from today. I'm in Woodstock, New York, and Chris is in Bovina. That landscape had an enduring influence on his work. We're going to be talking a little bit about that. He received a certificate of art therapy and his BFA from the School of Visual Art in New York. He studied at Yale University from 1972 to 1975. He moved to New York in 1976. He had his first solo exhibition at Philippe Brie Gallery in 1988. Since then, he's had numerous solo shows at Pierogi Gallery, Mitchell Innes Nash, Corcoran Gallery of Art, Kunsthalle Dusseldorf, David Kordansky Gallery, Anton Kern Gallery, and the Rodolphe Janssen Gallery in Brussels. Chris Martin is recipient of numerous awards and honors, including a 2002 Guggenheim Fellowship, a 1999 Paula Krasner Foundation Award, 2 NEA for Art NEA Fellowships, and he's been an important contributor and friend to the Brooklyn Rail over these many years. He has conducted some of the finest interviews that have appeared in the publication with artists such as Thomas Noskowski, Bryce Marden, Fred Tomaselli, Catherine Bradford, Bill Jensen, all close friends of his. And he's also contributed a number of fascinating essays, including Reflections on Alfred Jansen, one of my favorite texts on that marvelous artist, and the marvelous essay, Buddhism, Landscape, and the Absolute Truth About Abstract Painting, which I would recommend that people locate. So we're going to begin the interview. Chris, how are you doing?
It's a pleasure to be here, Raymond. Fong, Sophia, Charlie, everyone from the Brooklyn Rail, it's a pleasure, and thank you for doing this thing that you're doing.
So Chris, tell us, where are you? What are you doing? What's your life like right now?
I'm in Bovina with my wife, Tamara Gonzalez, the artist, and I feel very lucky. I have a studio to work in up here in the country. I get to take walks. My older daughter and her wife and child are nearby, so I get to see some family members. And we're trying to stay safe, and but basically feeling lucky to be here in a beautiful place and to be able to do our work.
Yeah. Has your work changed at all? Has your studio practice changed? What's different in the studio right now than the hustle bustle of Brooklyn and your former life?
Well, I think that as much as I miss people and the art world and hanging out with you, Raymond, in your house, or Fong, going to dinner with you, it's been lucky in some ways to have this enforced kind of isolation. And I have a studio here it had a lot of unfinished paintings and new paintings. So I've been working very hard. I think channeling a lot of my anxiety and uncertainty into making paintings.
Yeah, it's been such an abrupt shift. I mean, some of us are lucky to be able to get out and have a place to go to, and then there's just the sad feelings of so many people who are ill. I've had friends who have died. And there's a lot of suffering going on, and that's right there. This really is kind of a once in 100-year event that we're going through, and we're in the middle of it, or we're at the beginning of it. We're somewhere, and we don't know where that where is. So it's very much about living in the moment, isn't it?
Yes, there's just this generalized anxiety, I think, that I'm feeling, and many of us are feeling. It also takes me back to the pandemic that you and I and many others lived through in the 80s, the AIDS pandemic, and it brings back a lot of emotions about that. But this is also in many ways very different. They never shut down all the restaurants or businesses in New York City because of AIDS. At the same time, I know we all lost friends during that. So it's kind of a sobering flashback for me also to that time when a lot of people in the art world were dying.
Yeah, same here. Recently, I was reading some of Jerry Saltz's columns in New York Magazine, and I have a lot of friends who he seems to annoy, but I've always enjoyed Jerry, his writing and his mind. And one of the things I like about Jerry Saltz is he's always been mindful of the art world as an organism, as an ecosystem. And it's a very fragile ecosystem. And he's always addressed that, and he has done so recently. I won't go into an analysis of what he says. People can go online and read it, but he's been a critic, a writer who has been thinking about this and writing about this. Do you have any idea or any feelings about what you think the art world is going to be like coming out of this?
Gosh, that's a big question, and it will be different. Definitely things will never be the same, that's clear, and how they will change is hard to know. Certainly what we're doing right now and what Fong and the Rail team have achieved by starting this kind of online Zoom community is quite amazing. I don't think this will go away. I think that some of this connected thing through Zoom and people's reliance on online and computer communication, that's going to continue to grow, I think, no matter what happens. But I miss people. I miss going to openings. I miss seeing actual paintings in people's houses and in galleries. So I hope that comes back in some limited way soon, because I miss people, and I miss people. I miss that social world.
Yes. Well, I do too. And I mean, I had 4 shows I was working on, all of which are canceled, and it's just a state of limbo. My sense right now is that a lot of what made up the art world, which frankly was going a little too fast, with people flying around the world with art fairs, a new art fair opening every 4 or 6 weeks, things had accelerated to a point that was getting to be unsustainable, just in terms of energy, not to mention the carbon footprint and a lot of other things. I think a lot of the people who used to be in the art world for social reasons, the people who would fly in on a private jet to Miami, Basel, to go to the parties, to hang out with Jay-Z, to make the scene, I think a lot of that will disappear. I think a lot of the investment bankers, the hedge fund managers, the people who are putting together funds to purchase work on speculation, I think that will disappear. And that's not a bad thing. Because you and I both sort of entered the art world at pretty much the same time. And I guess this is where I want to kind of begin the discussion is your arrival in New York. Now, you were basically a Yale dropout, right? I mean, what was your experience at Yale? Who were the students? Who were the teachers? What was that about?
Well, I made some lasting friends there, and I met a lot of people who were graduate students in the arts. And those people, when I did drop out and come to New York City, I had a bunch of friends to look up, and that was good. I played a lot of sports. I learned a lot about drugs. I had a pretty good time at college. But so I came in 75, 76. I guess I was 20 years old, and it was a very different New York City in the 70s than it is today. A much smaller art world. Half of the city seemed abandoned downtown. There were vacant lots everywhere, hard to believe. Easy to find a job part-time and support oneself as an artist. There were a lot of things that were really great about the 70s art world.
Yeah, I started coming to New York. My brother was a student at Columbia, and I would take a bus in from Lowell, Mass, and sleep in the dorms and head downtown. And I remember Soho. Thing I remember about Soho was people burning pallets on the street in barrels to keep warm. And there was nobody on the street at night. There was that Eat restaurant that was set up by
Oh, this
Gordon Mata Clark.
Yeah,
and,
yeah.
And I'm blocking on her name, this marvelous artist who just died, Tina Gerard. But it was a very different place. And the paradigm of the model of the artist was kind of the art worker. Everybody wore denims and they took their jobs very seriously. You want to describe a little bit about that whole ethos?
Well, yeah, the people that were sort of the kings, it seemed, were the like Carl Andre and Don Judd, and there was this very we're workers, we wear overalls, and it was also a very kind of puritanical part of that minimal thing. Truth to materials, painting itself was considered very suspect, bourgeois. Color was not good. Figuration was considered outmoded and like old history. So it was a much more narrow environment. What I didn't understand at the time was I thought everything was happening in New York City. And of course, all this stuff was happening in Europe I knew nothing about. So I was completely unaware of painting in Germany or England or Italy until the 80s hit. And then I realized all this stuff had been happening. But I thought that art history went through New York City. And it was a very narrow vision at that point, a railroad track idea that the art world, you know, there was progress in art history. And things that were European were automatically suspect. And I think, you know, Don Judd was going, you know, telling everybody to stop painting. And this was the new American kind of progress happening. So it was exciting for me as a young artist and also very limiting. I think I agonized over not really fitting in to that world.
Yeah. There's also a very hard drinking world and a world with a lot of fistfights. I mean, you'd say the wrong thing and somebody just hit you in the face. I'm about an aesthetic idea.
People were not encouraging about young artists. It was like, you know, put up or shut up. You know, that was also a holdover from kind of the ABEX world where it wasn't politically correct in any way. And people challenged each other in a kind of macho, you know, you think you're a painter, kid, you know, there was that kind of challenge going on. Yes.
But then when painting re-entered in the 80s, it was a different kind of painting. It was painting after conceptualism, which I think is an important distinction, something important to note.
Yes, I think that Warhol had this, when I came to New York, I was hanging out with a lot of the kind of painter crowd. There's sort of Elizabeth Murray. I mean, I wasn't close friends with these people, but Bryce Martin, Elizabeth Murray, Bill Jensen, Ron Gorshaft. So these were serious painters, and they did not talk about Warhol particularly. They didn't talk about a lot of other parts of the art world. They didn't talk about photography. So when the 80s came, it kind of blew everything up. And Schnabel's first few shows were very influential for me. And then I saw all these German painters who had this wonderful kind of post-conceptual, people like Polka had a wonderful post-conceptual freedom in their work. And so I had a lot to learn at the end of the 70s. Things really opened up and kind of blew my mind in a lot of ways.
Yeah, well, Julian was very important in bringing those influences in. He knew Sigmar Polka, he knew Blinky Palermo, and he was a great promoter of their work. He was, yeah.
And also when Basquiat showed up on the scene, I remember seeing his Samo graffiti, from my window of my apartment building. Keith Haring was doing the subway drawings on the black paper that were so great. And there was this explosion of graffiti art. I hate that word, but there was this street art everywhere. So that really opened things up, I think, in the 80s as well for me.
Yeah, that's what I was really glad to see, was the street aesthetic coming back into art, because I think things were just getting much too precious.
Yes.
Yeah. And what kind of work were you making during this time? Where was your studio?
I lived in a building on Mott and Houston Street, right down the hall from Glenn O'Brien and the musician Robert Aron. There were a bunch of painters in that building as well. Building had no lock on the front door, I remember. All kinds of characters just wandered in and out and went to live on the roof. And I had a little apartment, and I started out painting my way through minimalism. Very quickly kind of learning a lot from Elizabeth Murray. And at the same time, making these very small, compact paintings influenced by Tom Noskowski and Bill Jensen, and an American kind of romantic tradition of Hartley, Ryder, Blakelock, that whole crowd. But, my friend Peter Atchison, the painter, lived in the building. He was making experimental movies. So he was dragging me to Second Avenue, to Jonas Meekas's anthology, and to see Brackage and Harry Smith. And so there was a lot of other worlds. There was the downtown music world. There was the filmmaking world. And then also for me, the poetry world. The St. Mark's Poetry Project was a big influence on me. That was very exciting to go there.
Yeah, when I first visited your studio, aside from the paintings, the things that really impressed me was you had a wall down the entire length of the studio, and it was all poetry. And it was all the same poetry books I had. It was Kenneth Patchen and Robert Creeley and John Wieners and Diane DePrima. And I could see that you were somebody who read poetry, was a real lover of poetry. That's always been the case with you?
Yes, less so. I miss all those books, I must say, being up here in the Catskills. I mean, Raymond, you knew all those people. I idolized all those people, and I would meet them or try to talk to them at St. Mark's when they gave readings. Going to St. Mark's Place on, I think it was Wednesday night, was the big reading of the week. I would see all these, I would see Alex Katz in the audience, and Meredith Monk and Diane Waldman or Ginsberg. So all these people were heroes of mine, and to see them and hang out in a building in the East Village was very exciting. I felt instantly like I was part of this history of New York, the history of, the downtown world of music and art. So, I love it.
It was very mixed in, and poets and musicians and painters hanging out, going to each other's events. I think a lot about the beats these days, especially I'm working on Gregory Corso's last 20 years of his poetry from 1980 to 2000 for New Directions. It's a remarkable body of work, but I keep thinking about this guy and how he had absolutely no interest in commercial success whatsoever. Neither did Allen Ginsberg, neither did Burroughs. I mean, the Beats were really remarkable in that they played such a central role in American culture, and they could not have been more non-commercial. It's really impressive.
Yes, and I think, the idea of making a living as a poet is, to all the poets out there, we should all be taking a poet to lunch or something. It's a hard way to make a living. I remember that one of my heroes at that time was Harry Smith, and one day after I had seen him give a lecture, I stopped him on Second Avenue and told him I thought he was a genius and how wonderful, and he'd really helped me in my life. And he listened to me, and then he said, Well, thank you, young feller. Have you got $5 on you? Which was quite a lot of money then. And I gave him $5. And I remember thinking, you know, what's wrong with this picture? I think this guy's one of the most important people in American art, and he's begging me for breakfast money. But
yeah, well, that's true. I can remember going to openings taking Harry to openings, Warhol, Rauschenberg at 142 Green Street, and Harry would be in these, you know, shabby clothes and an old overcoat, and I'd be looking around at these artists who were really on a kind of God level. And then there was Harry, and I would think, you know, yeah, what's wrong with this picture? Why? But that's the way it is, you know. I mean, Harry's time came later. Your achievement is in your field, and your time is your time. And it is amazing to see how Harry has had this tremendous influence, this posthumous career
right.
on American culture. But I think the underground filmmakers were a very important part of the general aesthetic. I know they're extremely important to a lot of the painters who I admire. We all kind of grew up on those films.
Brakhage had a big influence on me. And I have to say, Peter Acheson and Mark Potter, two artist friends, lived in the same building. They were very involved in that movie making scene. Peter would go and use the cutting machines at Anthology, or was it Millennium? But I'm really grateful they dragged me to all these films. And I heard Brakhage give long lectures several times, and he was a very impressive man. So, you know, at the time, the people that were making money were the musicians. It seemed like the rock and rollers were getting these advances for records or whatever, and they made money, but I didn't really know too many painters, or certainly not poets, or whatever, that were, people were surviving. It was easy to live in the city then. Dangerous, but you didn't have to worry about your rent so much.
Yeah, yes. Why don't we look at some slides of a show that took place 2 years ago at David Gordensky Gallery in Los Angeles, and it's early work. It's work from the 80s. So we're going to go through these, and let's give it about 3 seconds on each image, and let's just run through them. Big and small, right?
Yes. So these are paintings from the 80s and the late 80s. And the drawings and smaller paintings are from late 70s, mid 80s.
Now, an instructor who was important for you at Yale was Al Held, right?
Yes, he wasn't actually, he taught in the graduate school, and I finagled a couple of conversations with him. And his show, especially the work, he had a show at the Whitney Museum in the 70s, a retrospective. And the paintings from the 60s really blew my mind. And in a way, that's the reason I dropped out of school. I thought the paintings were so great that what was the point of staying? I decided just to go straight to New York.
Yeah.
And so he also just had an influence, not so much specifically in the look of his work, but as an individual. He was a very forceful, very powerful presence.
There's also a strong sense of the architectonic in his work, and how paintings relate to architecture, which is something that you've explored quite a lot in your work, isn't it?
Yes, I was always obsessed with the gigantic size and the scale that I could get through a kind of sublime, huge size. The other thing that Al was involved with was a process of painting and repainting. So he was the polar opposite of someone like Stella, who drew it out on the canvas and then painted it in. So that to me was always more like a graphic design situation. But Al was always involved with creating a kind of tension and personal space through adjusting things by hand, sometimes minutely. So in that way, he comes straight out of Warhol, who painted and not Warhol, I'm sorry, Mondrian, who painted and repainted and repainted. So that was something that I took away from my Yale experience, was they were all involved in Giacometti, and the studio school did that too, this sense of painting and repainting. People like Joyce Pensato, my departed dear friend, and Christopher Wool, they come out of that sort of a school that valued the hands-on physical creation and losing yourself in the painting of something. Very much a de Kooning kind of Abex ethos.
Hmm. Now that Kundalini image, had you been to India yet?
Yeah, I went to India in '83. Yes, I had. I had been to India.
That's almost a Keith Haring graffiti kind of feel.
Yes, this was this winged kind of four-legged figure that I thought of as a griffin.
Right.
And then by the late 80s, I was exploring a lot of different materials, and this painting is painted on aluminum foil.
Mm-hmm.
It's oil painting on foil, and it's quite large. It's probably 10 feet tall, 12 feet tall.
Getting into a decorative element, and also some of these next few, I think we're going to see reflect some of the opticality experiments and influence in painting. Was Philip Taft somebody who you saw and whose work you admired?
I loved his first few shows. I thought they were just terrific. He really did influence me in that way. But the funny thing is that I thought of these paintings that we're looking at as landscapes. So here's that winged figure again.
Uh-huh.
So that's a landscape. That's a Catskill forest in there.
Okay. And what's that?
Yeah, what's that? Good question.
Well, that reminds me of, and I did want to talk about tantric art and ask you about, because I know those books by Mukherjee on tantric art were important to you, and you saw a lot of that work in India. I mean, when those books came out, a lot of people accused him of making that stuff up, but it's an art that includes science and ritual and philosophy and astronomy and alchemy and cosmology. It's a container for all of those things, and yet it's a purely abstract expression. Was tantric? Were those books on tantric art important to you?
They were very important. I don't think I understood that tradition very well, but I was fascinated. I bought those books at Strand, Ajit Mukherjee, and would pour through them over and over. When I went to India, I thought I was going to find all this tantric art everywhere, and of course, it's quite obscure. You don't find it. I thought I was going to buy all this great little abstract things. I hardly saw any when I was there, but that whole tradition was very important because there was another alternative approach to abstraction, as opposed to the kind of Museum of Modern Art sanctioned railroad track of art history. Here was another whole different attempt to, not attempt, but a whole different methodology and spirituality involved in abstraction in a very down-to-earth way. It was very intriguing.
Louis, hold on this image for a minute. Chris, is this something where your friendship with Elizabeth Murray is coming through?
Yeah, I see Elizabeth Murray. I see sort of, there's a tree with, it's kind of bringing this serious painter tradition of abstraction, trying to drag it into the forest.
Yeah. And I also see early Frank Stella, like 58, 59, some of the pre-black paintings
Right.
feeling here.
Certainly Al, and but Elizabeth Murray had a big influence on this. Kelly.
Yeah. Yeah.
They were painting palette knives. So these paintings were so heavily worked. I think around this time, I had this thing where I would work on paintings and they wouldn't be finished for years and years and years. And I started to see that as its own kind of trap, that that I needed to find a way to make a whole painting quite quickly. And in that way, I learned a lot from the graffiti artists, because they had to make a whole big painting in a hurry. I remember around late 80s, Keith Haring did a big mural on a concrete slab on the corner of Houston and Bowery. And I watched him and an assistant make the entire huge painting in about a day and a half. And it was a terrific painting. And I went, wow, here I am struggling to paint and repaint these paintings. And this kid comes along and boom, he does a terrific painting. So that was very helpful for me to see that, and to see that I needed to be able to work on a big painting with the same speed that I worked on a smaller painting.
Yeah. Let's keep going through the images, Louis. Thanks. Oh, let's hang out here for a minute. This is an homage to Alfred Jensen, is it?
Yes, I discovered, that's what it says. Yeah. I discovered him, well, I guess I discovered a lot of people. Who was that guy, Tuckman, that did that book in Los Angeles?
Yeah. Maurice Tuckman, yeah.
Just a great book. And that book was just a Bible for me and Kathy Bradford and Peter Atchison and a lot of painters. I discovered Hilma Klimt first through that show, and it really pointed me to a much broader tradition of abstraction. I don't even know what that word means exactly, but Alfred was very helpful to me at a certain point.
Let's see, what's the next image here, Louis? Is this the last one? Okay, let's go back to the previous image. Chris, you wrote a piece for The Rail in 2002, Reflections on Alfred Jensen, and you said, actually, to call Alfred Jensen an abstract painter is misleading, because the paintings are so concrete. They don't just illustrate or describe ideas, they contain a tremendous amount of concrete information.
Yes.
Paintings may allude to a complex web of ideas, but they are almost absurdly specific. Nothing in these paintings is anything other than itself. I love your use of the word, your equation of the word concrete and abstraction, because, Charles Olson, around the time of Projectiverse 1950, what he was trying to do was to get rid of all of the things in poetry like simile and metaphor, where something is like something else. And he wanted to just present things in his poetry as themselves. And he used the word concrete. He wanted to get the most real thing, but he used the word concrete. And he came on this paradoxical discovery that the most concrete thing was also the most abstract thing. I think it's interesting that you put your finger right on this without probably even knowing that about Jensen.
Well, I was a huge fan. I think there was a show at Dia when it used to be in Chelsea on 22nd Street. And they gave a huge show to Alfred Jensen, which I saw a lot. I also had been hanging around a woman named Catherine Umstead, a lovely artist, and she had running a gallery on Broadway. And they had an Alfred Jensen show, which they kept up for 3 or 4 months. And I used to see all kinds of painters through there. The physical reality of an Alfred Jensen is so joyful and so sort of erotic and sensual. And what I understood, I guess, what shocked me was that because he had such a simple kind of, not simple, but he had this clear sort of abstract armature, he could then paint like a a 7-year-old, you know, squeezing the paint out of the tubes and with great sensuous delight. And I saw that the two things were there at the same time. This fantastic paint quality, the light coming out of the pure pigment. And then there was this, you know, you could go down these conceptual rabbit holes that I never really understood. I made a real effort to read things he was saying and all the ideas that were supposed to be in the paintings. And some of it I might have understood, but most of it I think I could never fathom, but that was all right. Because
I mean, there was Pythagoras, there was astronomy, there was the I Ching, there was numerology, there was cosmology. Yeah. Do you think he's somebody who people don't know about so much or don't see? Because I remember Pace showed him all the time. He was one of the artists who you saw more of than anybody else in New York in the 70s, maybe.
I know, and I think they were overdue for a big Alfred Jensen retrospective.
Yeah.
A joy.
Yeah. I remember there was one at the Guggenheim, and you just saw him all the time, and one doesn't see him so much anymore. Okay, let's go on with the images now. What can you say about your love of putting paintings out of doors and on buildings? Because I've been in many different cities and seen your work displayed like this.
Well, I love painting out of doors myself. I always have. And so it's natural to put, when you're working outside, you lean your paintings up around. And so I love seeing paintings in the woods or in the field. And then, of course, in the city, we were all, you know, seeing all this great art on the sides of buildings. There's a wonderful thing on Instagram now called Abandoned Paintings. There's a website where people send in their photographs of abandoned paintings. I love that. I love seeing art in the world. And New York City, well, so this was really fun. This was the outside of Kordansky Gallery, and I made these paintings to fit in light boxes. The boxes have their own lights. And it was a pleasure. I mean, you know, to have a painting next to a lovely cactus, it was, felt very LA.
Yeah.
Very much enjoyed that.
Let's keep going through these images now. All right. Now, also David Kordansky Gallery, but what year is this? I think this is like 2015. So these were new works at the time.
Yeah, this is work from 16, 15, 16, yeah.
Yeah. Let's run through these for a minute.
Oh, there's Amy Winehouse.
You're Marilyn. Your exhibitions are always so joyous. You really know how to command a space. It's one of the most thrilling things to be in a room full of your paintings. I haven't had that experience quite like that in many other places.
Oh, thank you.
I also like how, I mean, there's nothing wrong with being fussy if that's what you are, but you are not a fussy painter. I love the way you just lay it down, and the impulse is right there. And is that something you strive for?
It is something I strive for, but it's not actually something I achieve all the time. I think I meet people sometimes and they imagine I just have a lovely time in the studio, just putting down joyful, wonderful, you know, and actually there's a fair amount of painting, repainting, adjusting.
So that's a final look that you achieve. So that's a final look. Sorry, I didn't mean to.
Yeah, so when I do paint generally quite fast, and when it works, it's a wonderful feeling. And when it doesn't work, you start again. These paintings,
yeah, let's go back, Louis.
So this painting right there, I started making paintings with glitter, 15, 20 years ago. And then gradually glitter became more and more part of my practice, and I loved working with it. In this case, I covered a field of wet acrylic with a solid coat of glitter. So this painting was a solid silver painting. Then going into the wet surface with my hands and feet and brushes and stuff, it'd be like, when you have a fogged up windshield and you draw with your finger in the windshield. It's that kind of a thing where I'm uncovering the darker colored areas from underneath the glitter field. And I do this flat on the floor. It's just it was a very exciting new way for me to draw and to discover images.
Let's go to the previous image as well, please. Yeah. Similar?
Yes. Gold glitter and then drawing into the wet paint with glitter.
It's interesting what you say about wiping through the foggy windshield. I have a good friend who took a drawing class with you at Bard, and you would come into class and you'd blindfold the students and have them make drawings. And then the next week you'd burn incense and you would tell them, okay, make a drawing of the smell that you're smelling, right? And every week you were coming in with new assignments about how do you make drawings? How do you make art out of other types of sensory experiences?
Wow, did I do that, Raymond?
Yes.
Well, I don't remember so much of that, but I do remember that there were some great students at Bard where I taught very briefly, and I do remember there were times where we had a fireplace outside and we could burn drawings and paintings in the fireplace. That was a big hit. The students people like burning their work, and it's probably the high point. Yeah.
So did you enjoy teaching?
I find it very exhausting, and I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, that's good. Because, we were talking about Yale, and I was rereading Mark Stevens's wonderful de Kooning biography recently. And de Kooning needed the money in the early 60s, and he took a teaching post up at Yale. And he quit after one semester, and he said to Joseph Albers, he said, these students, they're horrible. Why don't you flunk them all? And Albers said, well, if they were studying to be carpenters or plumbers, I would. But they're going to be painters. They can't harm anybody.
Well, my experience of being taught art in college was pretty terrible, actually, I have to say. And I did drop out, and that was, I'm glad I did. Much later, when I needed to finish college, I went back to college and studied. Studying art therapy was very interesting, and I learned a tremendous amount. But I never had good experiences in art school, particularly. So my perspective when I've been asked to go back to art school is maybe clouded by that.
And do you have any, I know giving advice is probably not your thing at all, but do you have any advice for young people who are thinking about going to art school or in art school, or particularly the problem of having to pay for it and having to go into debt in order to get this kind of education? How useful is it?
Well, if you've got rich relatives, that's what they're for. They can pay you to go to art school. I think the best thing about art school is that you meet other young artists. And so maybe that's what you're paying for, really, is to meet and spend a couple of years with a group of comrades. It seems crazy to take on debt to be an artist, I have to say.
Yeah, I think other students...
how is it that rock and roll music or pop, has, rap music and hip hop music, there weren't any graduate schools teaching rock and roll and hip hop, and yet those art forms have thrived all over the globe. So it puts this art school thing in perspective, because there's people that want to start a rock band. They don't get an MFA in guitar. They don't need that. You have your peers and you hang out and you make a world for yourself. And that is, I think, basically how things are still happening. And now it's in Bushwick or Bed-Stuy or Berlin. And so I'm not worried about young artists everywhere. If they have a good heart, they're going to find a way.
Yeah. Let's keep going with the images, please, Louis. Fabulous.
Yeah, that's a moon. That's a moon star thing in the Catskills.
It's the night sky, right?
Yeah, it's a night sky.
You've always been intrigued with night pictures, tenebrism.
Dark paintings.
It's that hour where the phantoms emerge, where forms start to meld. Go back to that previous picture for a minute, Louis. You can't see, but you've got some pictures of Harry Smith in there.
Oh, yes, there's Harry Smith. Go to the next one.
Next one.
You gave me this, Raymond. I don't know if you remember. This was some blanket that you had found in Woodstock, in India. You found this in India, and you brought this back with the pan, the fairies, and the mushrooms. When you're up close to this painting, you see that these fairies actually have the face of like Shiva. And it's a particular sort of Indian hybrid, like Goa, fabulous image. And so I took your blanket that you gave me and I added flowers and some collage and some paint. But this was...
I was hanging out for a month or two with our friend Shiv Marabito, and we were in Goa, in South Anjuna, and I'd go around to the flea markets and the fabric stores, and everywhere I went, I was seeing stuff that was reminding me of you. T-shirts with enormous mushrooms and planets and fairies, and so I just started collecting things, and then I went to the post office and I put a big bundle together and shipped it off to you because I knew you'd find something to do with it.
And I did.
Yeah.
I still have a hippie tree that I haven't worked on yet, but yes.
Oh yes, I remember that. Yeah. And there she is. What can you say about Amy Winehouse? What is it because you've made a number of paintings for her?
Well, I think it was something I shared with Joyce Pensato. We were both obsessed with Amy Winehouse, as were millions of people. And I think that the music was so great. And when I first heard her, I thought that it's reminded me of sort of the great African-American artists I knew from the 50s and early 60s in Washington, D.C. that really shaped me. And I was shocked at first to realize, this is a young woman from London. But it's such a great artist. And then there was that sense that everyone could see that she was doomed, but no one apparently could do anything to help her. And so, her number one hit was, I Don't Want to Go to Rehab. So it was such a tragedy, and to see a genius like this die so tragically really hit me.
And in such a public way, a public spectacle. It almost occurred around the same time as Princess Diana, where it was just like a public spectacle.
Yeah, the year before she died, I started a whole series of paintings, and I had photographs of Amy Winehouse, and I had these Turkish evil eye protector things, and I was making these paintings. They were all called For the Protection of Amy Winehouse. And I thought maybe if I made these little talismans with Amy's image, we could somehow protect her. Obviously, it didn't work. In fact, the summer she died, Joe Bradley said that he knew somebody that knew her, and we were going to go to London that fall to meet her. I was all excited. I was going to finally meet Amy Winehouse, but it didn't didn't happen. Bless her.
Yeah, I still listen to her music all the time. It's amazing. And the Dap Kings. Okay, let's go. Okay, what do we have here? This is from
This is 79 or 80 maybe, and it's a painting I made living on Mott Street with Clint O'Brien, and a painting of psilocybin mushrooms. I think maybe painted on psilocybin mushrooms, I'm not sure. Another psilocybin painting.
Now, this seems to be a point where Bill Jensen, the influence of Bill Jensen as a painter, comes into your work strongly. Is that the case? Is that true?
Yes, I met him in the mid-'70s. I saw the work from 76, I think, 77. And I actually sought him out. I remember he showed first at Ed Thorpe Gallery, and then I saw works at PS1. And I was so, here I thought he was just a living embodiment of kind of that Hartley writer tradition in American art, and his paintings from the 70s were so great. And
yeah,
it was also this fascinating counterbalance, the idea that you had to make huge paintings to be serious. Bill's paintings were all very, they could be held in your hand. And I remember he said, I'm starting a new movement called Compressionism. Press all this stuff into these small slabs of meaning. And in that he was, there were a lot of downtown painters. Tom Muskowski was a great artist at that time, making smaller paintings and also fighting against this kind of giant legacy of color field painting.
Mm-hmm.
And he also showed me that you could use imagery, you could use deeply personal imagery, you could reference landscape in ways that were just archetypal, and for me they really rang true.
And he's still doing such extraordinary work. I mean, no painter today embodies the natural forces, embodies nature in their work better than Bill Jensen. I mean, I think he's really got that field to himself pretty much right now.
He and Margaret Lutzek, his wife, who's also a terrific painter, I mean, they're just great artists. And gradually we really became friends. And that has been a very lovely thing for me to be, for a long time I thought of myself as a student of Bill Jensen. I still am. Yes.
Yeah. Let's keep going with the images. I think we're going to come to the end of this another.
So that's a more recent painting finished in 2008 that was also the mushroom imagery came back. And this painting went through a lot of collage and changes. It's got a very gnarly surface.
Now, practically every time I've come into your, all right, let's stop. Let's go to the full screen of Chris and talk. I want to ask you about question about music. That'll be the next group that we look at, Louis. Practically every time, this is vis-a-vis that last image that we saw, but many of these, virtually every time I've come into your studio, you have music on, and practically every time you're listening to Miles Davis, but electric Miles. It's the electric Miles. It's Miles from 1967 to the last concert in Japan, like 76. It's really a high point in music. I think we both share this obsession with this period, and it's the colors, it's the sounds, it's the clothes. And I feel like you've listened to this music so much that you've actually found a way to channel this aesthetic into your paintings. Is that an accurate remark?
Yes, I don't know how successful I am at channeling it, but Miles Davis has a huge influence on me. I think I learned a lot about painting just from the music. And I'm not alone. I think lots of painters are deeply influenced and guided by the great musicians. I grew up in Washington, D.C., and in my house, I was lucky. My mother was a concert pianist, and there was lots of classical music everywhere, but my love was Motown music and the great African-American music I was hearing on the radio in Washington, D.C. So James Brown really sort of opened me up and shaped me, as did Marvin Gaye and the Supremes and so many great African-American artists. And then that led me to jazz, and Miles was my entryway into the world of jazz. So it's hard to say how exactly a work of music influences a painting, but maybe I'm also, as a painter, a student of Miles Davis. Yes, also.
Yeah, and that electric period of Miles, very much coming out of James Brown. Getting the electric bass, and it's fusion music, and it's a good word because it's fusing a lot of different styles. There are so many good videos. I mean, it's fortunate that at this point in Miles's career, he was touring Europe regularly, and they were very hip to what he was doing, and all the TV stations in Holland and France and Germany were giving him a full hour. And there are so many great recordings of him and his bands. And then, of course, the Isle of Wight documentary that just came out that is
right.
That's so fabulous.
Oh, yeah. It's so time, he and Jimi Hendrix were going to work together. And then Hendrix died of a heroin overdose, but they were planning to work in the studio together. Can you imagine how great that would have been? Oh my God.
Yeah, that's really one of the lost
the electric
albums.
The electric part of that music was this shocking new kind of sound available. And so I think that was very exciting to me, that it sounded sort of shockingly new.
Yeah. And yet it carries the tradition along with it. My friend Enrique Juncosa, who is the nephew of the painter Miro, when he was a kid, he was hanging around Miro's house in Mallorca, and he was practicing the electric guitar, and Miro came into the room and he said, "Oh, I hear you're into the electric guitar these days." And Enrique said, "Yeah." And Miro said, "I'm really into Jimi Hendrix."
I love that.
And Enrique said, "What do you mean?" And Miro used to watch TV late at night. He always had a TV on in his studio when he was painting. And the film Monterey Pop came on, and there's that scene where Hendrix performs and smashes his guitar and burns it. And he described that scene to Enrique, and he said, "That's what I'm trying to do in my paintings."
Oh, I love it. I love it. Well, Miro was so great at the end of his life, too. The last 10 years are fantastic. So I'm not surprised that he was open to everything that was happening. What a genius.
Okay, I want to go back to a couple of things. One is just quickly ask you about psychedelics, the LSD experience, psilocybin, and then I want to talk again a little bit about painting out of doors. So what can you say about the psychedelic experience that
I dropped out of school in the early 70s. So that's a moment when, pot was a brand new, exciting thing, and psychedelics, I was introduced to that. Peter Atchison gave me LSD at Yale, and for the first time, we went to the art gallery, and we're like crawling around on the floor. I think we were asked to leave finally. But like so many, people my generation, this was, my formative years were very informed by psychedelics. So I also discovered Electric Miles at the same time that I discovered mescaline. And it's also when I was really discovering abstract painting. So all of this was tied in for me. Certainly psychedelics, I took psychedelics mostly in nature, and it had a profound influence on the way I think of what's real, in the world. And at the same time, after, by the time my late 20s, I kind of stopped doing psychedelics very much, but they were very, very important to me in college.
Yeah, it's a real shame that they became criminalized and demonized by the government, because they really are. I'm not saying people should do it, but they for me, they were quite a remarkable experience in breaking down the hierarchies of vision and the acculturated patterns and seeing everything anew. And as you say, kind of as it really existed. And also the awareness of sentience, how everything is alive, looking at an ant, at a tree, at a mushroom, at a leaf, at a piece of grass, and understanding that it's alive and it's communicating to everything else around it. That was an experience, a hit that I got very strongly from it.
Also, I think there was a whole culture around psychedelics at the time, and so I read William Blake through that sort of lens, and people like Aldous Huxley were very important, and I was discovering Buddhism around that time. I remember reading all the Carlos Castaneda books, and certainly William Burroughs, The Age Letters. I remember the guy that lived across the hall from me and Glenn O'Brien, a wonderful Mexican guy, and he would bring peyote back from Mexico, and he had a churn, and I can remember getting fresh peyote in early days of Mott Street, and how exciting that was. But I think there was a whole kind of counterculture that surrounded psychedelics that also really informed the way I thought of it. And certainly the last 10 years or so, I've gone back to a lot of that imagery. So when I was like, 14, there were things in Washington, I guess they were called head shops or something. And you walked into this shop and they had Indian music, they had incense, and they had tapestries, they had like Hindu imagery. And, as a teenager, this was so exciting, this idea about psychedelics, and it was like discovery of sex and marijuana. It all seemed to be part of this glorious kind of awakening in America. And now I look back and I also see, what a sort of bubble that was. And also I just appreciate the sort of charming kind of painting that was happening, I guess the style that was also part of that psychedelic. Like that thing you just bought me from India, that kind of imagery. I love all that stuff.
Yeah. I had the same experience with head shops, and they'd be selling a water bed, and there'd be beautiful girls and guys with long hair, and my father would be trying to pull me to get me out, it was well, when you're presented with Nixon and the war on TV every night, and having to march with rifles in high school, part of the ROTC, and then on the other hand, you've got a head shop where you walk in and they're playing Big Brother and the Holding Company, and there are day glow posters on the wall showing various sexual positions. It's a pretty easy choice, I think, when you're 14 or 15.
Yes, it's like Eddie Izzard, cake or death, which one?
Yeah.
Cake.
Louis, let's look at the Walton images, because this is kind of a continuation of what we're talking about. Now, when I first visited you upstate, this is the house you lived in. This was the front porch, and it was in a very rural neighborhood. I mean, I don't want to say it wasn't suburban, it was rural, but there were lots of houses around, and it was a factory town. It was probably an hour north of Woodstock, an hour and a half. Let's keep going. And you were working up in the attic. That was your studio. There's a little bed in the corner. And this is the house. It's a hippie pad.
Paintings by Tamra and the Haitian painting. There's some tantric painting.
Yeah, describe the house.
Well, it was a little two-story house, and you know, this is real Trump country. A little village, Walton, New York. There's Peter Lamborn Wilson and Tamara. The house was filled with art of all kinds, and so this.
Now, we were working on 2 books at this point. One was a book you did with Peter Lamborn Wilson called Opium Dens I Have Known, that Shiv Mirabito published with Shiva Stan Press in Kathmandu, Woodstock. And then Tamara and Peter were doing a book called Hoodoo Metaphysics, which recently appeared from Autonomous Media. You know, okay, let's keep going.
So this was.
And this was. Yeah, describe your studio.
The town had fallen on hard times, and there were a lot of empty kind of industrial spaces which I could rent very cheaply, and this was one of them. This was preparing for a show at Anton Kern. There's Shiv.
Yeah. Now, at this time, you chose a very out of the way place. I mean, partly because it was affordable, right? You couldn't
so I could rent like 3,000 square feet for almost nothing, and we just trucked up all this. I was able to start a lot of paintings at the same time, and afford lots of paint and.
But what I liked was that you were not hostile toward the environment. You were very understanding and sympathetic and appreciative of these people and how they lived. And there were a lot of things like these little gnomes in the garden and part of the culture that you assimilated.
Oh, I love upstate culture and the county fair. I've been going to that county fair, the Walton Fair, since I was a baby. And so, you know, it's the best part of America in many ways. And, you know, yard sales, and they had an auction house that sold, you know, a box of junk for $1. I love gazing ball sculpture. I love all that concrete lawn ornament sculpture.
Now, when we get to the end of this in just a minute, which I think is right there, Louis, why don't you cue up the Opium Dens film? We're going to watch 2.5 minutes of a film of Chris Martin working on a book with Peter Lamborn Wilson from a couple of years ago in Woodstock. Just roll it whenever it's ready. It's a 2.5 minute excerpt of a little home movie. I'm going to see Chris in action, and we're going to hear Peter Lamborn Wilson reading his poems.
I'll bring it right back for you. I didn't press
Okay.
something.
That's fine.
What wonderful birds you have.
Oh, yeah, they're at the feeder.
Herat, Afghanistan, the old quarter, without electricity, sank each night into an ocean of stars. Odors of wood smoke, mutton, sewage, spices, like a bathysphere containing a whole city of mud domes, minarets, and moonlit courtyards full of sleeping camels. I've forgotten the owner's name, something Khan, a man of almost saintly generosity and genius, who had painted the underside of his den's dome with frescoes of folkloric paradisial foliage and beasts, red, black, blue, green, yellow, bounding lines on whitewashed plaster, a masterpiece and continual delight for smokers' hypnagogic candlelit eyes. His little son had to guide me through Stygian stinking mazes, past police, under the unpolluted canopy of the 15th century, back to my hotel in the new city, listening to horse carriages clopping after midnight somewhere off in the falling snow of Khorasan.
Okay, thank you. We can cut it there. Thanks. Chris, poet-painter collaborations. It's kind of a great thing, isn't it?
It is. I mean, it looked like I just ruined a couple of books there.
We hung them on the line. We hung them on the clothesline to dry, you remember?
I do. I mean, that's a great book because it's a great selection of poems from Peter. And, he influenced me a lot before I met him because his book, T.A.Z., really influenced me and many, many other people around the world. And so to hang out with the guy, it's always a pleasure. He's someone I really miss right now in this pandemic. I can't take him out to the Kingston Diner and Saugerties Diner and eat bad food. But so a shout out to Peter.
Yeah, I think TAZ, Temporary Autonomous Zones, published by Autonomedia, certainly an idea that becomes more urgent with each passing year, and particularly in the present dilemma socially. It's about new ways of organizing artists and musicians and poets and people organizing themselves outside of the official structures, which are pretty clear have completely fallen apart thanks to extraordinary greed and healthcare for profit and all of these other. I mean, it's a real nightmare that we're living with. Let's see. Let's go look at a few more pictures. I know we're kind of running out of time, and we're going to want to get to some questions. So let's look at a next group of slides. You know, there's Walton. That's the outside of the studio. Keep going. And this is where you live now.
It's a paradise.
This is what you're looking at every day, and there's your back porch right outside the kitchen, right?
Well, needless to say, we are feeling extremely lucky to be in this spot.
What's it like painting out of doors?
I love painting out of doors. The first great thing is that if you have a beautiful sunny day, you don't have to choose between getting work done and being out in the world. So it's wonderful when it's a beautiful day to be working and be outside. The light is fabulous. I can throw materials around with a different kind of freedom. With acrylic paint, I have a hose. I can hose things down. I can throw buckets of paint on things. And then just that sense of changing light and glancing around at light through the trees, all of this is inside of my work. I love working outside. Also, there's the ability to work outside and look at a painting from a great distance. So if you're 100 yards away from a painting outside, that's not a very long, but very few people have huge enough studios to really get back from work. So that's part of it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Let's go into the next group of images. This is your most recent show at Anton Kern in 2018.
Yes, a big show. So,
okay.
And you know, these, you can see landscape. I think the one on the left, there's a cardinal, there's also a salamander and some mushrooms and some imagery from, very much from the Catskills.
Is Sun Ra somebody you admire?
Very much. And again, there's that fantastic body of paintings and costumes and stuff that they were inventing in Chicago at that time, which is this kind of Afrofuturist, kind of Egyptian plus sort of planets. Plus, it's just fabulous art that was made.
Yeah, the album covers, the posters for shows. Corbett and Dempsey have in Chicago, that gallery, have done a great job in preserving and presenting a lot of that work.
And what just a
great
genius of a man.
Yeah. Again, taking the tradition from the earliest days of jazz, practically, right into outer space.
I mean,
that's one thing. Go ahead.
I think that you know, when we're surrounded by so many social uncertainties and chaos and suffering, I find that being in nature, you know, looking up at the stars at night, it gives me a wonderful perspective. It gives me some solace, some just to be in this tremendous beauty puts things in perspective. It gives me comfort and inspiration. And I feel,
me too. I think being New Yorkers, we you know, start to think we're at the center of the world, and there's the big world out there, and it's not all about New York.
No, but I think we're always, all of us, at the center of the world. Sometimes we realize it. And this obsession with Saturn, I you know, when I was a kid, you draw Saturn, and I think that Amy Winehouse joined this club of people that died when they were 27, you know, Basquiat or Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, so many great artists seem to die. And the astrological explanation is that something about the return of Saturn in your chart. So I started painting a lot of Saturns around the time I was obsessed with Amy Winehouse as well. And, you know, Saturn returns can wipe out a lot of 27-year-old promising artists. So,
yeah, it's a dangerous age. Okay, is that the last in this group? Let's cue up the Timothy Taylor. Okay, keep going. No, stop there. We're not going to do that yet. We're going to look at the Timothy Taylor video, which is a brief video that Chris, you made. You want to tell us about this?
Sure. This is something I made for Timothy, a little tour of my studio up here. And yes, that's what it is.
Okay, and this is going to wrap things up, so we'll take questions afterwards.
Good afternoon, it's Chris Martin here, up in the Catskill Mountains. Thought I'd give you a tour of my studio. Some of these paintings in progress, they're on the ground to dry, flat. A lot of my oil paint I mix up in buckets with alkyd medium. And so it comes out a very liquid enamel-like paint. And so a lot of the painting is done flat on the ground. And it dries pretty fast, and the next day I can get a look at what I've done, keep working. Some of these paintings were in progress, some of them have been in progress for a long time. Little Bob Marley keeps me going. So I want to give a shout out to all the healthcare workers. My daughter is a nurse and her husband Jared is a nurse practitioner right on the front lines. He's there at Yale New Haven Hospital. So I want to wish them luck and send them our love and thanks. This is a new painting. It's called a Seven-Pointed Star for Amy Winehouse. And it has Amy Winehouse here in the center of the star. And here's an old painting, an older painting. I think it was started in 2004 and finished in 2008. It's a psilocybin painting. And that's a painting from the 90s, actually I think the 80s, that I reworked like a year ago, last summer. This is a new painting, it's a sunrise. Check out this robin's nest. I had my car parked outside, and every couple of days the robins would build a nest on the tires, and I would clear it out, and 2 days later they'd build another nest. And I kept clearing the nest out. Luckily there were no eggs, so I didn't have to buy a new car. But they made this one in about 24 hours. Sometimes I think I don't work hard enough. You know, a lot of what we do as painters, you know, there's times when we're really putting on paint and working hard, and then there's a lot of sitting around or standing around and just looking. And I get to take paintings outside, see them in the sunlight, see them from a distance. It just instantly gives you a new perspective on painting. I spend a lot of time looking at paintings, wondering, like, what is this? Sometimes I know a painting isn't finished, or it just bugs me, but I don't know what to do. So I just look at it and think about it, and sometimes you get an idea. Bringing a painting out into the sunlight. Oh! Yeah, sometimes they fall over. I mean, sometimes I just leave them there, face down. Sometimes the painting is just going nowhere, and I work on it by just dragging it into the field or taking it out somewhere else and leaving it. But seeing things in the sunlight is a pleasure. This painting is an oil painting, acrylic and oil with glitter. I had this thing going for about 4 years, and I feel pretty good about it now. It's a moon painting.
All right. Well, Chris, I know you can't stand looking at yourself on film, so thank you for enduring that.
It's a pleasure, pleasure.
Let's look at these last few images, and then we'll wrap this part of it up and take some questions. The last few pictures Chris sent me the other day, texted me, and this is what you're doing right now?
These are about a year ago, a little more. There's very large glitter moonlight paintings.
You got your car in the studio.
Yeah, that's just taken during the winter. It was made in that fall before. Maybe they're almost a year and a half old.
A moonlight painting. Yeah.
And this is from the studio in New York just a few months ago. 2 recent paintings.
Beautiful.
And these are paintings from about a year ago. Or I came up when we came up here in March, I had these paintings and I reworked them a little bit. So these are paintings from about over, I guess the last couple of years I've been working on these large paintings. And that's a fairly new big painting, which I had started actually 10 years ago in Dartmouth and then dragged it out. Yeah, and so here you can see, it's just such a pleasure to be able to work outside on these big things and pour water on them, walk on them. Sometimes I get bird tracks across them. This is a painting of Bob Dylan I made about 2 years ago, and a friend sent me an Alvin Ginsberg shirt. So here I am posing with my Ginsberg t-shirt with the Dylan painting.
79 years old yesterday. Bob
Congratulations, Bob.
Go back to that image for 1 minute, because you know what is fascinating about that Milton Glaser image, which came out as a poster in the Bob Dylan Greatest Hits in '65, I think it was. He did it in '65. Did you know that's based on Marcel Duchamp's self-portrait and profile?
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that. That.
Yeah,
No.
that's what Glaser based it on, which is a work of art that was only 7 years old at the time that he did this poster.
Well, it's a fabulous poster that he made, and I've tried painting Dylan in different ways from photographs, and I found that the best way for me to get a handle on painting Bob was to take this poster and use it, try to make it my own. In this case, the painting behind it had actually a poem by Annie Lauterbach, this long, long poem written on the side of the painting. So it was actually a poetry painting, and then the painting was disintegrating, so I painted over the writing, which was falling apart, and then brought Bob in. So like Bob in the landscape.
Okay, what's next? Keep going. Cloud painting. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, here's 3 of the big ones.
Beautiful.
Yeah, no one's actually seen those paintings. And there's another Amy Winehouse painting and a painting in progress. They're both in progress.
And I think that's it. Okay. So Sophia, do we have any questions lined up?
Oh, yes, we do. We have lots of questions. Thank you very much for that journey we all just went on together. I will begin with Iona. Iona, I'll unmute you. You had 2 questions, but maybe just pick one and take it from there. You should be able to accept a prompt now.
Yes, thank you. Wonderful. Hi, Chris. Thank you so much for your presentation. It's so great to see all the sort of back scene your work. Inspiring to a young artist to see them, not installed in a gallery. But the question that I do have for you, thinking back on Schnabel's presentation that he also did on Brooklyn Rail a couple weeks ago, where he used material as an indexical gesture of history. Chris, I was wondering, how is material important to you, or does the final image hold more weight Can you talk a little bit about your material use, how you come at it, and ultimately the importance of non-painting materials in your process? So that was my first question. And then the second one, and I will let you answer whatever one you feel is better to answer. The other one was, how do you create bodies of work? Do you make them consciously, and how do you break them up and organize them? If so, do you base them around an idea, a song, what you have ready, or just what you're working on in the present, or even just visually? So thank you. Whatever you say will be amazing. And I appreciate your presentation. Thank you.
Well, thanks for the question, Iona. I was very impressed when Schnabel's first few shows in New York were a wonderful shock for me. I should also mention that Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg were also big heroes of mine, and Rauschenberg's work from the 50s and 60s, collage, had been a great inspiration. But in the atmosphere of the 70s and minimalism, a lot of that was shunted aside. And so when I saw Julian and all these great German artists, it was this great permission to open one's practice up to different materials. I think that for me, the difficult part of that was that the painter's painter world, the kind of Bryce Martin world, or the Bill Jensen world, these people are great craftsmen of oil paint. They're tremendously respectful and knowledgeable about the tradition of oil painting. And I just was never very good about that stuff. So it was very wonderful for me to start allowing myself to put things in the paintings, put collage things in the paintings, put objects that meant something to me. I used to always have newspaper in the floor of my studio. Constantly, I used it to sop up paint. Gradually, the wonderful newspaper images made their way into the work. I used to cover my buckets of paint with aluminum foil to keep them from evaporating. And then I would have all these torn pieces of aluminum foil with oil paint all over the studio. So then I started bringing aluminum foil into the studio. I mean, I couldn't do crockery. Julian had laid claim to that. But so various things that had personal importance to me made their way into the work. At one point, I remember I thought it was a good idea. David Humphrey came to the studio, this is a long time ago, and I was eating a peanut butter sandwich with banana slices on it and a certain arrangement, and he took a picture of that. He thought that was a really well designed sandwich. And I remember after that, I started putting bread in some of the paintings because I always had sandwich bread everywhere. And so it's like the first time I took a brush with paint and I was painting on a piece of bread. It's a thrill because you don't know how to paint on a piece of bread. You don't know what you're doing. You don't know how the paint's gonna stick or not stick. So when you put yourself in a position with new materials, you don't know what you're doing, and you can make a disaster, but you can also feel very alive, and all these accidents and things happen. So that engagement with materials was wonderful. That really started at the end of the 80s for me and continues today. The element of surprise, when you find yourself working with materials you don't know how to control, that's a wonderful position to be in. And your second question is about how to make bodies of work.
Or how do you arrange your own bodies of work?
Well, you constantly arrange them differently, constantly. You know, we all artists, you go into your studio and you move things around and you realize this painting relates to that painting. Mm-hmm. Having an actual deadline to make a paintings for a show, focuses one. And so then you start thinking, what's going to fit into this particular space? So you end up thinking about a body of work because you're thinking about an actual place. Sometimes I am conscious that I'm starting a group of paintings and they all have like a bunch of Amy Winehouse paintings or a bunch of paintings with the star imagery. But usually the paintings go where they want to go and corralling them into bodies of work is something that happens farther down the road.
Got it. Right. And for a prolific painter as you, who sort of work atemporally in a way, right? Like you always pick up paintings 4 years down the line, or sometimes, I could see how that makes a lot of sense. Well, thank you so much, Chris. I really appreciate your generous answers. I will bow out and let someone else have a chance as well. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So Jason, I'm going to unmute you now. Feel free to turn your video on too if you want.
Hey, Chris, how are you?
Hey, hi, Jason. How are you?
I'm doing well. Good to see you today, and thanks so much for this. This has been a real gift. I had a question for you. So, you mentioned a lot of artists who were influential in your early career: Al Held, Elizabeth Murray, Alfred Jensen, among literary figures and others. And I got this sense, and I've kind of gotten this sense through your career too, that, working through this community, through this historical moment is really important to you. And sometimes you'll have a direct homage to an artist like Jensen. And it struck me that this is in real contrast to a lot of the way that younger painters sometimes think, that they don't necessarily have this lineage or linear quality. They have this like ahistorical feeling about the way that they work. And I thought, how important is it to you to have this sense of community, this awareness of history, and yet to be a unique individual making unique works in the world? Is that something that you feel like is I tend to feel that way as well, but I'm curious to kind of see if you could speak to that.
Pleasure. It's a good question, and I think that, writers and painters, we work by ourselves, alone in a room often, and so the need for community is vital. I used to envy my, friends who were in bands or were musicians that worked in groups, and I always envied that. The guy that kind of formed my idea of an art community really was Ginsberg, and in his writings. And he was always, in his own writings, reaching out to establish sort of a big tribe, and reached out to was always citing his ancestors, his father figures, and he was very conscious of this group that it takes a village to sort of make a painting. So that's always been very important to me. And I think there's a little bit of magic when I was a young artist. I can remember running into William Burroughs on the street at my laundromat. He was taking his shirts to be laundered. And then we talked briefly, and then I talked to the Chinese lady about, this is this great gene. So that was so important to me. Like, I saw Burroughs today. It made me feel that I wasn't just a little kid in an apartment with no heat in New York. I was part of this, group of geniuses that were walking around downtown. So it's very helpful for me to be acknowledging all these heroes and heroines that I had. And then when you're with your small group, like Kathy Bradford and I and Peter Ash, we talked, and Rick Briggs, we talked endlessly about other artists, living and dead. And, Kathy and I would go down to like, which painting is better, or which part of that painting, and you like the corner, what she did here, what she did there. So we spend a lot of time thinking about work that inspires us, artists that inspires us. So that all seemed to come very naturally. That one could be part of acknowledge the group. I know that, at a certain point when records were disappearing from life, I had all these records, and it was very exciting to me to take a record of someone, like a Miles Davis record, and glue it onto a painting. And I felt that was a great way to kind of, what's that word? As an homage, or whatever, to other artists. And I continue to do that. There were certain artists that I met in the 70s, and they were not like that at all. They didn't want to talk about their friends or other, they wanted to act as if they were the serious guy. It was their ideas and their ideas alone. And they were very jealous of each other, you know, who did something first or who did it second. And that seemed very alien to me. I always wanted to say, I'm part of a big river. And that, and to be grateful for all these people that I think of as teachers. Is that helpful?
Yeah, very much so. That it's like gives us this bigger sense of community and how it affects your work, and I think it's quite great to have that be a part of the practice.
Yeah, we don't own the images. We don't own abstract painting. We didn't invent abstract painting. We didn't invent. You know, the idea that, you know, music's just been going on forever, since the Neolithic or way before, and it's still going on. And so we're part of something. Yeah.
Yeah, something much greater. Yeah. Thanks, Chris.
You're welcome.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So next we have Fong Bui. Fong, you should be.
Oh!
Get enough of you, I guess. Thank you, Raymond and Chris.
Thanks.
An extended conversation which we began even long before the Brooklyn Rail was created in October 2000. But what you say early on about fusion, Raymond, and then this is a question for both of you to mull over, but I think there's some sense of what you described about Miles Davis in the 80s, particularly the band. I went to see several concerts when I was in college in Philadelphia, particularly the one that he gathered up with Mike Stern on the guitar. I remember Marcus Miller on the bass and Bill Evans, Al Foster on the drum. That was such an amazing band. And to me, fusion is the key if it can relate to Chris's sense of synthesis of painting very big paintings and the smaller ones. And from the big, more in terms of sense of scale, one person, an artist that I don't think will do any justice if we don't bring him into this discussion is Forrest Bass, Chris. So I just wanted to sort of ask you that importance of Forrest Bass and the self-taught tradition combined, because you talked about earlier of Bill Jensen compression of energy and space in the small painting. So I think Bass seems to belong to that tradition too.
Yes, he's such a mysterious figure for me. I think Betty Cunningham, you know, took me by the hand and said, "Come here, young artist, come into the back room and look at these Forrest Basses." That was when she was working for Hirsch and Adler, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's how I discovered Forrest Bass. And David Reed had curated this amazing show, which I had the catalog of Alfred Jensen, Forrest Bass, and Myron Stout. So those three were all heroes of mine. But Bass,
right.
You know, in terms of abstract painting, Bass's paintings they're in some way, they're not abstract at all. He's supposedly painting the things he sees in his eyelids when he closes his eyes, or he's painting a dream image. So for him, he's painting something that he knows. He's just received an image and he puts it down. And what's amazing about the paintings is they do have this compressed energy, but he doesn't repaint his paintings. He doesn't work on a painting and go, you know, I should make the red a little darker. The sense that you get from his paintings is that he's like taking dictation and he's just saying, I got this image. I'm not sure what it means, but it has meaning. Here it is. This was given to me. I'm passing it along in a way which is very down to earth and painted so directly. So that seemed to offer this amazing freedom that one could go inside out of one's dreams or what are flashes of archetypal imagery, and one just channels it. So in that way, he's still an incredible inspiration, but also just such a mysterious man. So I do think about him a lot. I know that Kathy but Peter Atchison and I have talked about him endlessly. So he's one of the guys that's a great inspiration. I know that Andrew Masulo and I used to talk about Forrest Bess a lot, and Andrew actually owned a few, which I could see when I went up to his place on 74th Street. So he is a hero of that whole downtown moment.
There's a terrific documentary about Forrest Bess where Robert Thurman speaks about him, and this really ties in with tantric art. He was an artist who performed a sex change operation on himself, and you can learn about him and these really radical ideas that he had in this film. And Forrest Bess brings up another subject, a huge one, I think, for Chris and for me as well, that we didn't get into, and that is a couple of books called My Soul Has Grown Deep, which are outsider artists, mostly Southern African-American artists, Thornton Dial, Lonnie Hawley. Very important for you, Chris. Do you want to say a word about that?
Yes, I mean, I was always interested in, folk art, outsider art. It's horrible, horrible words, terms. And when I first got that big book of the Soul's Grown Deep book, it was just a revelation. So there's great freedom in materials there, but what is most inspirational is the fact that these women and men had a need to make things, and they just made them using whatever kind of paint, whatever kind of materials, whatever was available. That was all they needed. And they made profound, profound art. And Lonnie Hawley is out there today making great music and great sculptures and paintings. So that was very, very important to me to also to find art that came out of great deprivation and suffering and, really triumphs. And, these people made masterpieces without gallery support, without, with their own communities. Like the Gee's Bend community is very inspiring in that way. But that's another that's another hour here on Zoom.
Well, perhaps this is a good moment to segue to our poem for the day. Does that sound good to you, Bo?
Love.
This has been a real pleasure, and we're very lucky to also have a wonderful poet waiting in the wings. So, Connie, I'm going to unmute you, and then I'm going to introduce you.
Hello.
Hello. Hello. So, Connie May Concepcion Oliver is a Venezuelan poet and artist who lives in New York. She's the founding editor of Feelings, an online journal of poetry and art. Her second book, Science Fiction Fiction, is forthcoming this year from Spoiten Duivel Press. She is also a frequent contributor to the Brooklyn Rail, and we are honored to have her today. Take it away.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Brooklyn Rail and Sophia and Madeline and Anselm for inviting me to read. Thank you, Chris, Martin, and Raymond for the really engaging and illuminating conversation. I'm going to be reading a prose poem from Science Fiction Fiction. The book itself is about color photography in Miami-Dade County at the turn of the century. And the poem contains like some of my photographic work, which I could share a little bit of. And the poem is called Time. Time. The advent of the digital SLR and later of the smartphone has changed what it means to be a photographer, has complicated the difference between person who photographs and photographer, has drawn attention finally to the unnecessary distinction. When I was 15, my father drove me to Little Havana where I photographed the Elian Gonzalez protests. Police, who'd been tear gassing residents, stopped us and searched my dad. I remember being asked to give up the film and my camera, my father saying something inaudible in the chaos, and being eventually shooed away. To be allowed to keep my film that day had meant something to me, because it was all that I had with which to hold an image. Miami's beauty is drunk and severe. In San Francisco, squinting under mist, I waited in vain for thunder and lightning to satisfy me. Photography is special in its ability to trespass on other representative systems. The verbs we use as photographers tell us. We take and capture images. We burn them on silver-coated surfaces. There's a suggestion of solicitous destruction of the actual and the lived, which for conventional photography is only deepened by the digital experience. Digital, relating to touch, to the index finger landing on a surface and signifying thereby, I save, I delete, I send to oblivion, I disseminate to the world, I like, I bear witness to and dignify. The city of Miami has destruction within its history, character, and destiny. It builds and demolishes infamously. One is discouraged from vocally liking any one landmark, as this is a guarantee that it will be leveled soon after. The Magic City might be aesthetically enchanting, but it is also a literal site of true, practiced, and informed mysticism, unmatched by any other metropolitan area of the US, except New Orleans. The communication with syncretic religions and cultures of the Caribbean can be found everywhere, in the routine and in unobscured realms. There is an ecology of transience that informs the viewer, manages the image, and dissociates the photographer. This is more compatible with late and recent photographic models, whose structures of rapid composition, editing, and deleting often mirror the regenerative personality of the city. Like the digital image that appears and dissolves, flashing and ungraspable, eternal in its tenuousness, this city has more in common with impressions than it does with propriety. It is a passage that foreshadows the immaterial, plunges into the Atlantic, and defies being seen. And these are some of, I guess I'll share this one because it's Miami International Airport. And it's like this corridor where the light changes the colors over the course of the day. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And really, thank you all. We have these conversations every day at during the week at 1 p.m. And tomorrow we'll be hosting poets Bob Holman and Mahogany L. Brown. So feel free to unmute yourself on the way out to say goodbye. It's been our pleasure.
Thank you, Raymond. I just want to mention that the film that Raymond referred to, Forrest Bat, is called Key to the Riddle, made by our friend named Chuck Smith, who actually came on to the first week of our new social environment. And you can look that up. Maybe we'll try to screen it one day. But thank you so much, Chris.
Thank you, Fong. Thank you, everyone at the rail.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Fong.
Thank you,
Raymond.
Chris.
Thank you, Fong. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks,
Bye.
Raymond.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you so much.
Bye, Rose.
Thank
Always a
you.
pleasure.
Thanks, Rose.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Rail.
Thank you, Chris.
Raymond.
Thanks, everyone.
Hey, Fred.
Bye-bye.
Guys.
Bye, Roxanne. Tom.
I barely heard this sound like
Hey, Tamara.
water.
Hey,
Thank you.
Hi, Tamara.
Hey, Roxanne.
Hey, Tina.
Hi.
Good morning.
I can't hear anything.
Hey, Todd. Well deserved lunch.
I should show.
Oh,
Bye.
Bye.
Nice notes, David.
bye.
Here's the official note.
Hey, David.
I ain't running for secretary, but it helps me metabolize the shit.
How are you?
Ciao.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Hey, Christine.
Happy
Hi.
Memorial Day.
Ciao, Christina.
Hi. I should show this is my Chris Martin. That's
Yeah.
old.
Oh, yeah. Oh.
I have a couple.
Oh, this one.
This way we can see all our dirty laundry, but also.
Oh.
Nice. Like your curtains.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Amazing.
Chris, thanks everybody.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophia.
Bye.
Thanks, Sophia. Thanks, Lewis. Thanks, Charles.
Thanks for making it such a joy. Oh, hi, Natalie.
Mm.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.